Hey everyone, great week this past week, week 4, as we transition now to week 5. Especially appreciate how some of our interactions in the forums are leading us to share a little bit more of kind of where we're reading from, some of our places of service in various parts of the world, various parts of the U.S., some of the challenges that we face in those settings and how that's sort of shaping the way we're trying to make sense of some of the tensions and difficulties in Matthew. So that's great. Also want to just affirm, I think, the ways that we're finding to sort of gently disagree with one another, to sort of be able to express where our interpretations are kind of bumping into each other's and seeking some clarification, some more understanding. I think that's great. And I just want to encourage that because I think it's when we're able to name some of those points of tension or even kind of conflict between the way we're understanding the story that we go a little bit deeper. Both in our own understanding, obviously, as well as in others. So that is great, and I like the tone of that, I think, for our discussion. It's been constructive and I think useful. This week, we are transitioning to a part of the story where the tensions are going to rise markedly in the narrative. And this is, as the narrative tells us, the aftermath of Jesus's sending out 12 disciples with the significance that has, as we discussed this past week, to the villages and towns of the lost sheep of the house of Israel. This has provoked a reaction, difficulties in various places, and those begin to come more directly into the story in chapter 11, especially through the witness of John the Baptist. It's a really sort of striking reintroduction of this really important figure in the beginning of the drama, and now has a public exchange through his disciples with Jesus while he is still in prison. And so I hope you'll be able to sort of dive into how that's in some ways kind of crystallizing the tension that is taking shape in the story. And that is going to give way to Jesus sort of making a distinction between those who regard themselves as wise, who think that they're seeing clearly, and are regarding Jesus as sort of a dreamer, someone who is a threat because of the way that he's leading people, and are basically responding to his call to repent and to live in certain ways of justice as something to be roundly rejected or at least neglected. With this comes some specific conflicts over the institution of the Sabbath, which I hope our reading from earlier in the course and maybe just some background that you realize as a really political, economic pillar of the fabric of Jesus's community in the land. Lots that we could say there, but suffice it to say that this is not a clash over something that is petty, a clash over something that the authorities are simply being needlessly legalistic about or something like that. It's important for us to grasp the gravity of this institution, how it has been threatened historically, all of its social implications, to see the significance of Jesus's clash with authorities over this institution in chapter 12. That then leads to an even more intense and public conflict after Jesus sort of withdraws, a conflict over words, words that are being spoken in this increasingly sort of intense public clash. There's a kind of sort of panicked quality in some ways to the words that are being spoken. There's a really difficult passage that presents this to us. It begins with a person who is blind as well as mute, and by implication deaf, because of the presence of a demonic force in his life. And Jesus heals this person, and the reaction of the crowds that this may be the work of the Son of David alarms the authorities to such an intense degree that they begin to say publicly that the power by which Jesus is liberating people like this man is actually the power of Beelzebub, the power of the Satan. And this is something that then gives way to a whole exchange between Jesus and the authorities over the dangerous power of words. And the reason I'm spending a little time on it here is that I want you to call to mind, as you wrestle with that really difficult passage in chapter 12 that includes Jesus talking about a certain kind of sinning, of blaspheming, of speaking that is not forgivable in this age or the age to come, to call to mind some of our earlier material on the nature of forgiveness as it's presented to us in the Old Testament. The fact that it involves a process that entails bodily transformation, not just of an individual person, but of a whole fabric of community in which individual lives have the shape that they do. It's, I think, only within that kind of frame of reference for what forgiveness means that we can understand what the unforgiveness is that Jesus is describing. So you'll obviously hear me attempting to thread my way through that difficult passage myself. And following this is a request for a sign by the authorities, sort of attempting to manipulate Jesus into acting on their terms. And that sort of request for a sign is rejected by Jesus. He predicts that they will only get the sign of Jonah. And the segment of the narrative then concludes with the approach of Jesus' family because of the kind of shame that he is bringing on the family at this stage. Their concern about what the ramifications of his actions are going to be, and they are attempting to call him back. And in the midst of that, Jesus says words that really challenge the fundamental bonds of family in the face of the power of the kingdom from heaven that is transforming the bonds of the fabric of Jesus's people in the land. It's only at this stage that we get the kind of speech that Jesus begins to use in chapter 13, the third discourse of Matthew. It's the discourse of parables. And I say it that way because often we have neglected the location in the narrative of Jesus' beginning to speak in this unusual sort of cryptic form. And it has a definite purpose that is dependent on its location in the narrative. So you'll hear me describe that in the podcast exposition of this segment of the narrative, and try to sort of help you wrestle with what the meaning of the parables is in light of why Jesus begins to speak in parables, and what particular form of speech the parables are, and the kind of power that that form conveys. So that's going to be crucial to our interpretation of the parables discourse, which is the final part of our sort of narrative study for this week 5. So that's what's coming in terms of the material. I think some of you have rightly kind of guessed the method to my madness with the way that I have you working through the narrative each week. Usually I want you to work on the text itself without a lot of commentary from me or others, dealing with the particular sort of key interpretive moments that I call your attention to and the questions that I ask you to address. I want you to work on that first before you move on to the material in the second response forum, because that's when you're going to get obviously more secondary voices, including my own, whether written or this week it will be primarily audio. And I want you to sort of have formed some of your own emerging interpretations of the narrative before you come under the influence of secondary voices, including my own. And that's hopefully to allow your own imagination to be worked and stretched in your interpretation of Matthew, and then to actually have something already at least somewhat formed in your mind to wrestle with as you engage others' interpretations in the second response forum, including my own. Because I want your interpretation to be able to enrich mine, to be able to criticize mine, and I think the result is more kind of richness of understanding of the narrative for all of us, even if that involves you or I sort of backing off of a certain reading once we realize that there are certain difficulties with it that someone else in the class has presented us with. I think that's part of the sort of shared learning process that we're doing really as Christians together in a community of study. So, one last thing maybe to say is that we're 1 week closer to your first formal assignment of an interpretive working paper. I gave you some commentary, kind of directing you on that in last week's intro video, as you're just trying to make sense of what that assignment is about. I've added to the material for this week not only the guide for that assignment, but also samples of that assignment that I want to encourage you to begin to look through as you're imagining how your own paper is going to take shape. So be sure to take advantage of those resources. A couple of the things that you'll see in the stuff for this week, optional, for example, instead of requiring you to read something that I've written, as I've done in past weeks, this week I'm going to just require that you listen to a podcast exposition of this segment of the narrative, and then what I've written on it will be optional. This is actually a chapter that I'm still in the midst of finishing, and that's part of the reason why I just like to offer it as an option rather than something that I'll require of you. Also, I'm going to add something that you might find intriguing as an option this week, and it is an introductory video that I made for a class somewhat like this one that I taught a couple years ago, several years ago now. And it just so happened that in the 5th week of the course, I was in Jerusalem working at a sort of think tank of sorts that had me both in the Old City as well as in the West Bank, wrestling with all kinds of issues related to the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and trying to situate that conflict historically, wrestling with a whole spectrum of both Jewish and Muslim voices, as well as Christian Palestinian voices, as part of my time there. Anyway, it just so happened that I was in the city of Jerusalem, and I thought that I would film the introductory video right there at a key sort of place in the approach to Jerusalem that becomes so significant in the narrative a little further along, and to try to frame the emerging tensions here in chapters 11 and 12, and then the parables discourse of 13, in terms of how the events that took place there in that place where I'm standing making the video, how those events were sort of the sort of the eventuality of the tensions that we're already seeing in chapters 11 to 13. So I hope you enjoyed that optional video of me in Jerusalem, if you get to it. Have a great week. Looking forward to the conversation.